And then I will get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here this evening. Our program tonight is Environmental Justice and You, and this is part of our ongoing work to prepare people for Environmental Day at the Capitol. But also, I think now more than ever, it's important that we be talking about environmental justice. At one time, we had a Department of Environmental Quality Director in Arizona, and it wasn't actually that long ago, who said there's no such thing as environmental racism or environmental injustice. And so um, we all know that that is incorrect, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And towards the end, we'll learn a little bit about one of the bills that we'll be working on for Environmental Day. But tonight we're so pleased to have with us Richard Galan. Richard is a seasoned advocate and community organizer with extensive experience in managing national and state level youth campaigns. He was originally born and raised in Southern California and has been in Arizona since 2012 when he attended the University of Arizona. Richard started his advocacy journey while attending community college in California, advocating for access to affordable higher education, and has worked in several advocacy areas since being here in Arizona, including education, environmental issues, LGBTQ plus, education, youth organizing, along with working in several election cycles. Richard comes from his previous role as the National Organizing and Training Manager for the Environmental Defense Funds program, Defend Our Future, working to engage and train environmental advocates within the 18 to 35 age group. And some may remember Alex was part of that program as well. Richard led a diverse team of organizers and volunteers around climate policies, created comprehensive environmental justice and DEI trainings, and was one of Black Millennials for Flint's Young, Gifted, and Green 40 Under 40 awardee for his national work in environmental justice. And um, we were very honored to work with Richard in his previous role and also honored to have him here this evening. So, Richard, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandy. Like I told Alex, I was like, anything Sandy wants, I will definitely help out where I can because I loved working for with y'all. So yeah, good evening, everyone. We're gonna get started and have a quick agenda and some housekeeping. Um, like Sandy said, I'm kind of here on my personal time, so I didn't know if I should like put it in my bio. But I am currently the organizing director with the ACLU Arizona affiliate. But like I said, I'm here in my personal time. So just to let folks know, I'm not just chilling, even though I wish I could just be chilling at home ignoring all the horrible things that are happening, but I am still working in other fields. So yeah, so if we can take a moment and just like introduce ourselves in the chat. I can't see the chat, but if you could just put like your name and then it's dinner time and I have not eaten yet. So if you could put like your favorite meal or restaurant. I may or may not be using that chat to figure out what I'm going to eat later as our little icebreaker. And while we're doing that, I will go over our agenda for this evening and some community guidelines. So this is going to be a really quick version of my environmental justice and you training. So I'm going to go over the definition and the principles of environmental justice, give a really quick rundown of where EJ started, how identities impact environmental injustices, um, climate migration that we are seeing due to the how our climate is changing for the worse, unfortunately, not for the better. Um, and then go over some of Trump's executive orders that impact climate on that he signed on day one. And then some other ones that were signed after and that have some impact or direct impact on environmental justice. And then bills and actions that folks can look into and do after this, and then Q&A. Um, so we do have a little bit of smaller group, so we can do this more as a discussion. I can't see folks. I do get the chat. I don't know if that is also showing for everyone else, since I'm sharing my screen. But if you have a question, comment, please just come off mute and then we can have that discussion right then and there. But some community guideline things. So we have definition checks. So if I say something, a term that you're not familiar with or acronym that you're not familiar with, please pause or flag it for me so I can give the definition of that so we're all up to speed and on the same page in the conversation we're about to have. Move up, move back. So if you're someone who is always asking questions, always being part of the conversation, and dominating the space, I'm going to ask you to pause and take a check to see if you are always the first one speaking, if other people aren't engaged in the conversation, and just move back, and vice versa. If you're usually someone who's a little bit more timid in the chat or in conversation, I ask you to move forward or move up. So you can engage, share your thoughts. If you have a question, usually one or two other people have that question, or if you have a lived experience that would better serve to the group, that would be great for that, as this is a collaborative learning experience. So we're all going to learn from each other. Oops, out. I am happy to say that I have not had to use this one because I'm usually able to cut off or flag things that might seem offensive, inappropriate, racist, homophobic, all the terrible things. That can not come out of malicious intent, but the way that we are brought up in the US, we have some bad. I don't want to say bad, but we have some unsavory thoughts and ideas that we are socialized with that might penetrate how we see subjects and people. So, luckily, no one's had to use that one, like I said. Brave space versus safe space. This is kind of tied back to the move up, move back. As much as you put into this is going to be as much as you get out of it. And then also, if you say something that's problematic, not once again, not intentionally, but we will stop the conversation and call that out because don't want folks to perpetuate all the isms and phobias. And when it comes to environmental justice and climate work, we want to make sure that people are leaving here with a good understanding of those things and then being able to unpack some of them. And then Las Vegas rules, what's said here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. So if someone tells a personal story, unless you are able to reach out to that person, please do not go around saying that Sandy told me about this really personal story and how she learned X, Y, Z. Take the lesson from what was said, And then you're able to share those lessons learned opposed to the personal story. Within this training, I give permission for folks to use any stories that I use as anecdotal evidence and whatnot within moving forward. Any questions or any other community guidelines people want to add?
Richard, I was just going to say I can help you monitor the chat, and then also because we are recording it, if we do get into portions where people are sharing and they don't want others, we can edit that part out. So just
Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you. Yes, watching the chat was good because I'm going to ask a question for folks. On a scale of one being I don't know really anything about environmental justice to 10 that you wrote a doctoral thesis and you know everything about it. Where is folks' knowledge on environmental justice so I can better tailor the conversation on that? And if you can just put 1 to 10 in the chat really quickly, that would be very helpful. And then Sandy, if there is a number that's coming up the most, if you can let me know, that'd be great.
it looks like we're around 7 or 8. So.
7. Okay, okay, good, good. That's great. That means we can have a little bit more in-depth conversation with the limited time that we have. So environmental justice textbook definition. And the principles, since most of us are around 7 to 8, I'm not going to go over that, but that's the definition. But the EJ principles is something that's very important to environmental work, climate activists, especially those who are from marginalized communities, and BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And it's that ability to live within a safe environment, have access and I should have added this, equitable access to quality in health, employment, education, housing, and transportation. Those things within our current political system of our country are not easily accessed or equitably accessed. And your race, sex, gender, social economic status, um, age, ability, and sexuality have a huge role in playing into one's ability to access resources, access safety, even and what barriers and roadblocks are placed in front of them and how many based off of their identities. So for myself, I am a queer cis Black man. So I have a lot of barriers from race, sexuality, opposed to someone who may share the same identities, but they are like a white man. They have a certain level of privilege that's given to them through whiteness, that's not given or harder to access depending on how far from your proximity to whiteness that might be. So EJ principles really center, and these are like the big seven, but there's like a whole other list of those that go more into depth or in our like subcategories of each of them. That when doing environmental justice work, really paying attention to how a policy is impacted, not just from like a race or gender status, or I'm sorry, like a race and economic status, but also like sexuality plays a role that we'll go into, age, ability, etc. So really quickly, the birth of the environmental movement started in 1979 through Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management. It was Margaret Bean, which was like the plaintiff and the face of the case on behalf of a Houston community, which is the Whispering Pines community. And so what had happened was that Whispering Pines had wanted and then did put in a landfill within close proximity to the public, which is a waste field. We know all the nasties that go around with that, not just in terms of the actual waste and chemicals, but the smell that impacts communities and those around them. And so they took it to court. It was Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management. The outcome was in the favor of Southwestern in denying a temporary injunction to the landfill. So after that, which is a picture on the right, the community, what was predominantly made up of a Black community, started protesting. There was news segments really talking about the injustice because the claim was that Southwestern picked the area that they put the landfill in specifically because they believed that it would be an easier place to put it in terms of resistance from a community. And 79, we know that wasn't the best time for racial relations, and saw that the community was not valued in terms of its economic value because that impacts home values and desirability to be in that community. But in terms of racial value, because close proximity to landfills can have some real negative impacts on one's health. So this was kind of the formative birth of environmental justice. Around this time was when environmental justice was coined. There was a few things happening in the 60s around the civil rights movement beforehand that tied into the concept of environmental justice. But really, this court case slash demonstration slash protest is what really kicked off the start and solidifying the term environmental justice within the American lexicon. And like I said, if you have any questions, just speak up and or comments and let me know. So going into environmental justice, so I pulled out a few things when it comes to injustices and identities. So here are I pick some four things. So race, gender, sexuality, and economics. And there's a lot more intersectionalities of all of these and how different identities impact. But these are the ones that we can easily see, and the things that you will most likely see when like news is covering a climate disaster or studies are usually using race and economics or race and gender within their studies within environmental justice, depending on if it's like health related on what communities impacted the most by like when we were in the pandemic around COVID. Um, but race, Black and brown communities are disproportionately impacted by climate related, I missed the words, apologize, related chronic disease. A really good example of this is in Louisiana of St. James Parish, also known as Cancer Alley. We all should know about that area. There's a high rate of cancer within the community, which is predominantly Black community, because I think there was upwards of 150 different types of like chemical plants and processing plants and all the things that create terrible air quality and carcinogens throughout the parish, throughout that Louisiana parish with I want to say if I remember correctly about 50 within a certain vicinity of St. James. Um, Economics, so those of lower socioeconomic status are less likely to be a part of and attending meetings where decisions are made. So a lot of the time when we're putting in a landfill, a power plant, wherever it might be, they don't just take their city map and throw a dart and be like, this is where we're going to build this. Um, those things go through planning, through city council meetings, and months and years of planning and permitting and then building and construction. And they should take account with what the city wants, and where the city wants to put said facility, plant, landfill, etc. Those of lower socioeconomic status are significantly less likely to be a part of that process because they're at work. They're usually city council meetings are usually not done at the best time for working families. It's usually between start times can be between 6 and 7 p.m. That's when times when people are just getting in from work. They're starting to make meals for their family, taking care of their children. If they do have children, being able to have childcare to be able to attend these things. Being in city council meetings are also difficult. The bureaucracy and how to navigate them is really difficult. That is, unless you are working within government, you have been able to study how these things work. It's a huge learning curve. I know how to be able to read policy and can attend these things because one, I work within social movements. And two, when I was in community college, I was in a program and group that dealt with higher education. And so we had to read policy within California on different policy perspectives and things that were happening to impact the community college and university system, which is not a thing that most people get in terms of understanding policy. And if you are someone working long hours or to multiple jobs, your ability to be able to attend those things are very more restrictive, meaning the folks that are most likely going to be impacted the highest are um, low socioeconomic status communities that usually make up Black and Brown communities because those voices aren't being held. On the flip side, money allows us to mitigate climate. In Arizona is a good example. Everyone can't afford to run their AC in the middle of summer when it's 110, 115 degree outside, and that they're impacted by the increase in temperatures that are happening, and they are not able to mitigate those things with AC, or they're able to run AC, but their bill is so high because they may live in an older house that doesn't have proper insulation, and they know, but they're not able to afford fixing it, to not having the proper windows, etc. Um, Lastly, on this slide, we have gender and sexuality. So women in queer and trans communities are experience higher rates of houselessness. Going to back to the example, it gets to like 100, I think was the high last summer, like 116, 117. It feels like every year we're breaking records in all the worst ways. And folks that are experiencing houselessness are in those extreme heats here. And then other parts of the country in extreme colds. So if folks remember, I think it was like 2021 when there was that polar vortex in the northern part of the country. There people were outside in that freezing temperatures. I remember reading a news article where a community leader knew that people were outside freezing, getting frostbite, or worse, and they rented out a small motel to just be able to provide housing for a few days. Um, so those extreme weather, um, houseless folks are impacted by that. Coupled with there is oh, I'm blanking on the term, but it's infrastructure, hostile architecture. There we go. That city used to kind of design out and weed out antisocial behavior, and I do that in air quotes because the behavior is houselessness. So when you see a park bench that's like weirdly shaped, that's like comfortable enough to sit for a few minutes, but like you can't lay out on it, when you see bike racks in really odd places that you're like, no one bikes over here. Those are hostile architecture, which is usually placed in places where folks gather. That's like either under shade, that allows folks to be able to just like rest for a moment. And so those are a few things that impact houseless folks, which queer and trans, specifically queer and trans youth and queer and trans youth of color, and then women and women of color experience higher rates of houselessness, unfortunately, within our country. I want to take a quick pause, see if anyone has any questions or comments so far.
Karen did have a comment in the
Yes.
chat, was sharing a story. I had just one real quick one before I go to that, and that is in Phoenix. We've seen it even more overt with actually putting up fences around parks. I mean, it just drives me crazy. Karen, did you want to come off mute and share your quick story?
Sure. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for being with us, Richard. Just wanted to add to what you were talking about in terms of the start of the environmental justice movement, and that was that around the same time of the work in Texas that you mentioned, that the Reverend Ben Chavis and some other UCC, United Church of Christ clergy, supported folks in Warren County, not New Mexico, North Carolina, who were protesting the placement of a landfill for PCBs, which had already been banned by the government in their community. And so that was, again, part of sort of different places, but same time frame as the movement was getting started. So I just threw that into the pot as well. And then the UCC, about a few years after that, published a study called toxic wastes and weight toxic wastes and race, sorry, in the United States, which also helped to launch that movement. So lots of different streams to that are still moving, which is good.
Yes. Even I usually have this in my fuller presentation, that is geared towards younger folks, which I'm starting to realize there's people that don't realize certain events happen. So like a good example that we can see um, from the Texas community, the Houston, Texas community, in more recent event or more like recent times. That a good example I like using is the Flint water crisis. And a personal example, and I remember when being in Detroit for a work training conference. And I would think it was on the way back to the airport. And so we grabbed a Lyft for 7 to the airport. And we were talking, me, and two other of my colleagues, I think Alex you were with us in that ride. And we were talking to the Lyft driver, and he was like, "Yeah, I live like no more than like 10 minutes from the impacted community." And he was like, "That is a more affluent, predominantly white in community. They're like, we haven't had any water issues. It was like we're not that far." And he was like, I have friends that are in the impacted area that had to have water bottles, had to like get jugs of water and do all the things. While a 5-10 minute drive away, whole communities were impeded by the switch from the water source that they were using. And that had a whole bunch of, as you know, a whole bunch of medical impacts on those communities. And I still want to say that folks still are like wary of the water. I know that was the case before the pandemic happened, and then that I think the pandemic this like sparked a whole bunch of things, and folks were just like, I people were like, give me water bottles because I don't trust our government, which rightfully so. So yeah. So climate migration, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So there is climate refugees and climate migration. Climate refugees are usually from out of the state and or country that they are from, but they don't have the legal protections and definitions that are applied to like traditional refugee status. So it's a little bit more difficult for folks who get refugee status from out of their country into another one that has been impacted by um, climate disaster. But climate migration is from state to state or even large air for like larger states, so like California and Texas, from moving from like Southern California up to like Northern California. And climate migration, I wanted to talk about this because of the recent California wildfires that happened, or that is slash did happen within different pockets within Southern California, where whole communities are burnt down, houses gone, everything gone, and people now grappling with the decision of, do we stay and rebuild in this area, even though we know that wildfires have become more frequent and more disastrous over the years. Being from Southern California, I've always watched all the things and the wildfires that happened when I was a kid in high school and started my college career in California, are nowhere near where they were nowhere near the frequency and the intensity that they have been in the past few years. So folks are now grappling with, do we stay or do we move somewhere else to that will help mitigate this one threat of climate disaster? But we know that there's other areas like Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, Virginia, and Tennessee that was hit by a hurricane, Helene, the fall, I think August and September or fall of last year, that had some real devastating effects on parts of those areas. To be able to where FEMA is had to come in, aid. We can have a whole conversation about FEMA needing to help all of these red states, but current president wants to eliminate FEMA. That's a whole conversation we could have here, or you could pull me on another time. We can rant about that. And then one of the biggest ones I remember, and I was a kid, that I personally felt the impacts of was Hurricane Katrina, that happened. What was that? I think it was in middle school, so that was like 2000 and oh, I should have pulled up the date. I'm early 2000s. I can't remember when Katrina hit. Um, But I remember the disaster because I had family that lived, luckily not in the way, but they were in the state. So just the structural disaster, and then people and families got bussed out across the country, to be able to either start anew or be able to like temporarily be somewhere while they figure out how to rebuild in their communities. And my middle and high school were two schools, that had folks from Louisiana, who were now in, I grew up in Moreno Valley, California, a little blip town that most people don't know about. And we had folks come, we had families and students from who were impacted by the hurricanes in my classes. And then potentially Arizona, in the next 30 years. So there is studies that are happening now, that, if we keep at the current bad pace that we're at, the six counties that are highlighted in red, depending on where you're at, I'm in Maricopa County in Phoenix right now, are going to be very difficult to inhabit in the 30 years just because of high temperatures that will be happening. And we're also on the verge of having like half the year being 95 plus temperatures, which I live in Arizona, but I absolutely hate the heat. So that just sounds unpleasant and, in general, and then that will have devastating impacts, because outside of Pima County not being on here, Maricopa County is one of the most populated counties, or actually is the most populated county, in Arizona. And then we have these other ones. So this is going to impact a whole bunch of folks. I did see that there was a few chats sent, so we can go to those.
Yeah, I just put 2005 for Hurricane Katrina. So,
Okay.
and then, and Karen added that also not only humans, also creatures and plants will have need to migrate. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. So yeah, let's go over two of them. There's a whole list of them, and we're all feeling the vibes and the sadness of this the first 2 weeks. So I didn't want to go super duper into that, but two um executive orders that were signed on day one, which was the putting America first in international environmental agreements. So this was the withdrawing from the Paris Agreement or Paris Climate Agreement, which most, if not everyone, expected since that is what happened during his first term. That is the pact agreement, promise, whatever words you want to use, that, the countries that have signed on are going to make a concerted effort, to combat, climate change and do whatever infrastructure, technology, etc., can and needs to be done to make sure that we are able to get within the goals set within the agreement. And then it's like unleashing Alaska's extraordinary resource potential, which also, if y'all haven't read some of these bills, they're being introduced in Congress and all the executive orders, they have the most extravagant, over the top names that are just wild to me. But that one is increasing oil production and rolling back restrictions on drilling, which we know that is all not the greatest thing while we're trying to move towards a more energy dependence and cleaner energy. There's another one that targeted wind power energy under the guise of wanting to know what the environmental and animal impacts are, because Trump believes that wind mills kill a whole bunch of birds, thousands and tens of thousands of birds each day and year. So that put a pause and review on land leasing to be able to build those things. And then the other one that's not directly environmental, but it's the executive order and then overall attack on DEI and DER programs within the federal government. So anything that is dealing with race, gender, all those things are have been stopped. Employees, I haven't kept up on the employee bits, in terms of like reading actual articles. I've just been hearing the whispers of that they're just trying to get rid of all of them and not have them fold into other departments and agencies. But that would have an impact on the EPA's Department of Environmental Justice. Um, because that directly would be considered a DEI program. And I believe there is another one that specifically targets rollbacks and having the agency take on, or not take on, but look at environmental impacts within communities through the environmental justice lens.
Yeah, he I think rescinded at least three executive orders that were specifically environmental justice related ones, including a Clinton and I think a couple Biden ones. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think so everything that was either undone during his presidency under Biden's presidency related to climate, I believe he's rescinded most, if not all of that. And then it's starting to go into other people's presidencies and stuff too. So it's voting is important, folks.
Yeah. Patrick also added, I think the drilling for oil and mining minerals will impact the most vulnerable as well, disproportionately, for sure.
Yeah, so I know so the way I got into the climate movement, it was I was working with Environment Arizona during the summer of my sophomore year, doing door-to-door fundraising, which I do not recommend anyone doing that unless you absolutely hate someone and you want them to suffer, suggest them get that job. But it was on stopping drilling within the Grand Canyon for oh, I'm blanking on the mineral.
It was uranium, I think. Uranium.
Uranium, yes, thank you. And so that would have a huge environmental concern because the Grand Canyon does divert water to us. So the water quality and safety with Environment Arizona was one of the major concerns because that would have a huge impact on almost everyone in Arizona. Um, so yes. And then I think this is the yes, bills and actions portion. So I can pass this on over to Sandy.
Great, thanks. So as I think folks know, the Arizona legislature is not a hotbed of activity for promoting environmental justice, but there are individual legislators who are interested and willing to promote bills to address environmental injustice. And I wanted to mention one of the bills that we'll be supporting for Environmental Day. It is House Bill 2367. It was introduced by Representative Oscar de los Santos, and it deals with environmental permitting requirements, burden communities, and it requires that a definition for burden communities be developed, or I should say there is a definition for burden communities, and the burden communities then are there are policies that are evaluated and permits evaluated based on the disproportionate impact that they have on those communities. And if a community is overburdened with, polluting facilities and those types of things, then the agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, for example, could deny a permit for a new facility that would place further impacts, on that community. So I think an example of a place that could benefit from something like this is Randolph, Arizona. It's like more than 90% people of color. It is right next to the town of Coolidge, and it is surrounded by industrial facilities, and Salt River Project just increased the size of a gas plant there. And that's a place where you could say, okay, this community has already been overburdened by these facilities, and it's time to say no to additional actions. They can also require remediation, like if there's a site that's already been polluted as well. So anyway, we'll have a little description of that, and hope people will at least talk to legislators about it, even if they won't hear it, because it's important that we continue to talk about environmental injustice, environmental racism, and some remedies. And if we can get things in the law, then we don't have to worry that every time there's a change in administration, an executive order is overturned. So that's one of the bills. There are some other bills that obviously affect environmental and climate justice, bills to allow for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There are a couple of bills specifically dealing with extreme heat and how to provide relief to people, outdoor workers particularly. And then we'll also be advocating for funding for extreme heat mitigation and relief, because the dollars that communities have been using to try to save people's lives are mostly gone. They were ARPA dollars, and so we are also going to be advocating for funding for those programs so we can continue to have heat relief areas, have them open at night as our nighttime temperatures continue to be higher and higher. And so those are just a few things that we'll be looking at. We'll provide some additional details when we get into the bills more next week, but I just wanted to give you a little bit on those actions.
Thank you. And that's the closing. This was a really short presentation that I have. That is not my email. There's one too many L's in it. But I'll do question and answers, and then I will retype my email in the chat. I do have a significantly longer, more in-depth presentation. It's environmental justice. It's same title, Environmental Justice and You. It's a 3-hour presentation that the first half covering the understanding of identities and intersection and how that plays within social structures. And then the second half takes that training and goes more in depth into some of the topics I talked about today, and really uses some more studies and case studies on how identity has a direct impact with what access folks will have to resources and safety, or what barriers slash what struggles or terrible stuff that will happen by government depending on their identity. So if you are a part of an organization or a group that wants to have a little bit more or not a little bit, have a more in-depth conversation and training on identity and environmental justice, please feel free to reach out. That is my personal email. Um, that once again I will put in the chat. And then if you have any questions about it, I can give a brief summary and overview through email. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see folks' faces. And we can open it up to questions, comments, or anything with the few minutes we have left, because I think we go out until 7.
Yeah, well, thank you, Richard. This has been great, and I'll um, see if anyone has any additional questions. Oh, that's your.
Yeah, so that's me. Mhm.
Yeah. One question I had, I mean, we're trying to work on for Environmental Day state level policies. Although the burden communities one would also affect local government, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on things that, you know, cities, towns, local communities, uh, kinds of policies they might put in place that would help advance environmental justice.
I think in terms of policies that I have seen more so or less focus on the environmental portion, because there's a lot of orgs and communities that like know what they need in their community. They are in a colder area, so they know to help mitigate harsh winters, they should be putting in warming centers in their community. They know that they need to be having more access or allowing other community members having more access within the decision-making process. A lot of the focus within the folks that I know doing more grassroots, especially in this day and age, is more on the political side in terms of like getting folks in the door to vote for folks who are actually who actually like believe in climate justice, environmental movement as a whole, getting folks into the door of these decision makers at their city council meetings, because a lot, especially within the political climate that we are in today, a lot of representatives, not just in our state, don't really care if it doesn't benefit them or if they think it's a threat or not a threat to their reelection. So there is like the general, not, I don't want to say general, but there is like the things like the bill, the one that you mentioned, 2367, making sure that there are better policies in place to make sure, ideally, that like these harmful facilities aren't placed within communities of color. But a lot of folks are like, we need to like yes, us advocating for this is good, and pushing for legislation with community groups creating their own legislation, organizations sponsoring and creating legislation. But they're like, we also need folks that are like understand and down for the cause, so we don't need to pull tooth and nail and show the health disparities and show the economic impact and have 15 folks tell their stories and why how half their family has cancer or something else terrible, and try to like get in the door with like we need folks to vote and we need folks to show our political power because then it's significantly easier to introduce legislation because like we were talking like before is like this bill's great, but we needed to get it heard on the floor first. And like if you're the majority of your state legislator is made up of climate denialists, people who don't care, you can have all the pretty bills and all the bills that do all the things that we need to do. But if they're not getting heard, then it doesn't matter because they're not getting heard, meaning that they're not getting voted on. They're not getting voted on. That means they're not being implemented. And so a lot of folks are starting to now like I understand it's a twofold thing. Like you need the bills, but also you need the people to support the bills, create the bills, and make sure the bills get heard on the floor and voted on in the way that we want them. Or vice versa, terrible bills being introduced and then getting like struck down because they have the people to do it.
Great, thanks. And then Ian just said, and another issue is making sure communities, have access. So sort of like the reverse of putting the worst facilities in these communities is to make sure they have access to parks and public lands. So
Yes, there's green spaces drastically improve mental health. That was before Defend's tragic downfall. That was one of the things that we were working on, is green spaces, urban green spaces, because predominantly in communities of color, especially lower income communities, are significantly less green spaces in those areas so that like the mental health piece, which is tying into environmental work, is there. And also, we know Arizona is a good example because we don't, especially in Phoenix, there's very few green spaces. So we have large swaths of urban heat islands. So when we are in the summer and we had 115, 100-degree heat during the day, we don't get any reprise during the evening, where it's 1 o'clock in the morning and it's still 102 degrees outside, and then 8 a.m. comes and it's already 95. So green spaces help even with that. Because it's I'm not the full scientist, but I was like, I understand this. Trees, grass, good because they absorb heat. Um, but then also making sure it's like appropriate for the climate. So we're not trying to put like trees and full lush grass areas everywhere because that requires water. So appropriate landscaping to create green spaces that is appropriate for the climate that the community, city is in.
great. Did anyone have one last question? I know we're a little over. If not, we'll just thank Richard and thank you all for being here too. And we'll go ahead and share this with the folks that didn't make it. And yeah, if folks are interested in a longer, more in-depth presentation, Richard can give you more information on that. His email is in the chat, and if you lose it or anything, just reach out to me and I can put you in touch with them. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Hope everyone has a good rest of their night.
you too. Good
Thank
night.
you. Bye.